Now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady and thank her for her service, Ms. Bush from Missouri. You're recognized.
Yes, thank you, St. Louis, and I appreciate you, Chairwoman, for convening this important hearing. And I'm so glad to hear all of this advocacy for those who are incarcerated. I just wish I would have heard it be this loud and this, this big push for it when we were talking about mostly Black and Brown people. But I'll move on. As the Congresswoman from Missouri's first district, I've heard from my constituents behind the wall, many of whom who have shared their horrifying experiences of unsafe, unsanitary, and inhumane conditions while incarcerated before and during the pandemic. From traumatic lockdowns to being denied visitation for months on end, this pandemic has laid bare the extreme violence inherent in our prison system. For 3 years, this pandemic has deprived thousands of people in our federal prisons and jails of their health and well-being. More than 1 in 5 federally incarcerated people have been infected with COVID-19, and at least 279 people have died. Our prisons are a petri dish for infectious disease outbreaks, and the Bureau's policy to release thousands into home confinement under the CARES Act has reunited families and it has saved lives. Ms. Levy, thank you for your powerful advocacy for home confinement. Can you talk to us about your experience since being home under supervision and about the psychological impact of being sent back to jail in June of last year while you were attending computer class during your home confinement?
I really think this might have been the first time that I've even addressed the psychological effect. Um, you come home, you have expectations, you reuniting with your family, getting yourself back together, doing things that are to just show your self-worth, to show your community, show your family that you're a changed person, that you're not the same person who went into prison 16 years beforehand. That's your dream, that's your hope, that's your prayer, that they can see who you are now. And so that's what I began to do. I began to advocate. I began to organizations that had helped me while I was inside. I connected with those organizations. I tried to make sure that there was anything I could do to speak out and let them know what my prison experience was like and what I thought was needed. One of the things you all talking about today is the lack of reentry. I took that computer class because coming home at the halfway house, I was refused. There were 100 computers in that halfway house. I was refused to go back there to use any one of them.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of things that are happening to people who are on home confinement. Those are the kind of things that are lacking in the reentry process of us coming out. Using the phone, those kind of things. But the psychological effect of being sent back, I weighed 169 pounds. I now weigh 138 pounds. Uh, just those 21 days back inside, it's devastating. It's devastating, especially when you know that you were doing all the right things. And there's, like I said, I'm not just talking about me. There are thousands of people who that threat. Oh,
That's right. That's right. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah,
We thank you.
there are thousands of people who
Yes.
that threat is still over their heads. That that home confinement,
Right.
that monitor is on their ankle, and
Well, let me
doesn't work right all the time. So
let me add.
whatever you all can do towards
Right.
making compassion release more effective, more efficient.
Well, that's our duty as lawmakers. That's our duty to represent, and it's imperative that we prioritize the public health and safety of all people, not just those that, agree with us politically. In a society with more than 140,000 people in federal custody, this is the only way to do it. We have to decarcerate, we have to grant clemency and move people out of prisons and jails and back home to be with their families and in their communities. Um, I asked for unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter that Congresswoman Watson Coleman and I led today, seeking clarification from BOP on the implementation of the new OLC guidance for those on home confinement pursuant to the CARES Act.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And I also asked a unanimous consent to enter into the record testimony from Wendy Heckman and Deonta D. Brooks on the challenges of home confinement conditions in federal facilities and earned time credit.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Chairwoman. We must not close our eyes to the tragic circumstances behind prison walls, and we must not turn our backs on those who have been released on home confinement, who are still living with uncertainty about whether or not they'll be able to stay home. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. I'm pleased now to represent and to recognize the gentleman, Mr. Massey.
Thank you. And thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this hearing. St. Louis and I are very troubled to hear about yet more military waste from the IG audit. TransDigm sells a linear actuating cap, which is used in both the Eagle F-15 and Stratolifter C-135 airplanes. According to the IG report, TransDigm sold this part to DoD for $7,495 per spare part, despite it only costing TransDigm $189 to make the part. The price has increased by 400% in just the last 3 decades and doubled in just a 3-year period. Mr. Tenaglia, why would DoD pay double what it paid for the same spare part just 3 years prior?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Part of our analysis is looking at what we've previously paid. Ideally, we're looking at what other competitive consumers are paying in the marketplace. For this particular item, and I don't know if the exact same item is sold in the commercial marketplace. I suspect it is not. And then the reality becomes whether this is a flight safety item, the leverage that we have. We need the part as a sole source supplier. If there's no other source to buy that part, we're going to need to make the purchase to keep our aircraft flying.
Yes, and so $189 to make, but $7,400 is what is being paid for this. The IG audit determined that TransDigm's excess profit for this part was over 3,800%. Just to be clear, that is not the profit TransDigm earned. Mr. Stein, how can TransDigm justify, though? How can you justify charging $7,000 for a part that just costs $189?
I'm glad you asked that question. It's a great question. There's a commercial equivalent for that part. The commercial equivalent costs $8,182. We gave the DoD a 10% discount on that part. And over 5 years, the DoD ordered less than 40 pieces. Over 5 years, 40 parts. It's so small and irregular. And we gave a discount of 10% to commercial. It's simple to explain. I don't understand why we're here even. We're giving a discount to commercial prices.
You're giving a discount on something that costs $189 to make. Mr. Stein, will you commit to paying back the excess profit TransDigm received in this example, as well as the other 105 parts identified by the IG as returning excess profit? Yes or no?
It's not a yes or no answer.
Yes or no? Because what we're talking about here is something that's $189 to make, not necessarily what somebody else is charging for it. It's $189
we
to
look
make.
forward to working with the DoD.
Reclaiming my time.
Okay.
It's essential that TransDigm pay back the $20.8 million it made in excess profits as a result of this price gouging. As lawmakers, we will also work to ensure that this abuse ends. Recouping those excess profits is the difference between having housing or not, mapping environmental racism or not, having clean drinking water or not. $20.8 million could fund housing for tens of thousands of our veterans, many of whom are far too often living on the street. And I know because I'm out there working with them. It could map environmental racism in hundreds of communities like St. Louis that are suffering from polluted air and climate change. It could provide millions of gallons of clean drinking water for children and families, especially Black and brown families all across this country. Instead, more than 50% of the exorbitant $778 billion defense budget is given to military contractors. Ms. Hull, would you say that the linear actuating cap represents an isolated case of DoD waste and mismanagement of money?
The part that you mentioned was the highest excess profit percentage that we found during the audit. But the profit percentages ranged anywhere from 2.8% to 3,850.6%.
Despite receiving hundreds of billions of dollars every year, the DoD has never detailed its assets or undergone a complete clean audit, likely leading to the kinds of abuse and waste we're discussing in today's hearing. I'm encouraged by the steps this committee is taking to address this pressing issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon, you're now recognized.
To yield to the gentlelady from St. Louis, Missouri, Vice Chair of this committee. Congressman Bush, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
St. Louis, and I thank you, Chairwoman, for convening this important hearing. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the experiences of 17 women across 5 federal facilities, which have been provided by the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. In these emails, women in federal custody detail horrifying accounts of not being allowed to get out of their beds all day because of COVID lockdowns, being forced to eat expired food, having little to no access to medical services to treat cancers and other underlying conditions, having to pay $2 to file a sick complaint. This is all happening under your watch. These are complaints coming from not one or not 2 facilities, but 5 different facilities, which makes clear that these issues are not isolated, but they're systemic. These women cannot hold you accountable, Mr. Carvajal. They cannot, but we can. And I would like to use this opportunity to ask you questions that they cannot directly ask you out of fear of retaliation. So Mr. Carvajal, yes or no, are you aware of these complaints across so many of your facilities?
Congresswoman, I'm not aware of those particular complaints, but I'm certainly interested in hearing from you and your staff so that we can look into them, because I find that if that happened, I find it unacceptable.
Thank you. Thank you. Our staff will be in touch. Thank you for that. Are complaints filed by people in BOP custody being logged, and am I able to access those logs?
We absolutely keep a log of complaints. We take all allegations seriously. We have an Office of Internal Affairs. We follow the process. We work with the Office of Inspector General, and when needed, other law enforcement agencies, and certainly the FBI and investigatory agencies. We take all of those complaints and allegations seriously, and we look into them.
Am I able to access the logs?
Congresswoman, if you'd like, I could have my staff reach out to you, see if
Okay.
particular information you're interested in, and if we can, we will provide that to you.
Thank you. Thank you. In the midst of a raging pandemic that has made incarcerated individuals uniquely vulnerable, rather than allowing people to serve their sentences from their homes with their families and away from the trauma and abuse of the BOP system, the federal prison population has grown. Keeping them in prison, it is an act of cruelty. In April of last year, you told the Senate Judiciary Committee that 50 to 75% of those incarcerated have been reviewed for home confinement, and that 24,000 out of over 150,000 people in federal custody have been placed in home confinement. As of today, have all of those incarcerated been reviewed for home confinement now instead of the 50 to 75%?
Congresswoman, we review all eligible inmates for home confinement under the CARES Act. We did that. We've placed over 37,000 inmates. 9,000 of those, more than 9,000, were specific under CARES Act placement. Those are 9,000 inmates that would not be out in community custody at this point in their incarceration. And our population is actually reduced, Congresswoman.
Okay, well, we looked at the website earlier today. So is the website inaccurate?
I'm not certain which information you're referring to.
We went to the Bureau, the Federal Bureau of Prisons website. 2 weeks ago, I, along with Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, we sent a letter seeking clarification from the Bureau on the implementation of the Office of Legal Counsel's new guidance for those on home confinement under the CARES Act. We asked for a response no later than February the 7th of this year. Can we get a commitment from you that such a response is forthcoming, Mr. Carvajal?
Congresswoman, I'm aware of your letter and we are certainly working on answering it. Understand, please, that there is a clearance process of which I do not control, but we are committed to getting you a response to your letter.
Thank you. My office will be in contact. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
This is the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Bush, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. St. Louis and I rise today because if America's students are not taught the truth in school, we can at least make the floor of the House of Representatives their classroom. My name is Cori Bush, but Bush was not the name that my paternal ancestors in Nigeria carried. Bush was the last name forced upon them by their slave masters right here in America. My maternal ancestors carried the last name Blakeney, forced upon them by their slave masters in Pageland, South Carolina. Our Black ancestors were kidnapped, stolen from their homelands. They were the 12 million Africans who were shackled, branded, and packed into the bows of slave ships during what is known as the Middle Passage, where 2 million Africans died. Poor ventilation, burning heat, no room to stand, no room to turn their bodies, forced to lay in their own feces and urine. They were starved, dehydrated, poisoned, and beaten. Those who survived the Middle Passage survived only to be brought onto these shores, bought and sold at auctions like the goods their forced labor was producing. These auctions launched a long-standing practice in America in which white folks, including white women, scrutinize and violate the bodies of Black people, especially Black women. We're going to tell the truth today. Black adults and Black children enslaved and forced to endure being tormented, being tortured, being raped by white slave owners on slave ships and on the plantations. Our ancestors tried to escape the bondage of slavery, just to be hunted, captured, imprisoned, executed via slave patrols and convict leasing. Those institutions whose primary focus was to regulate, exploit, and control Black bodies. More than 1,700 congressmen once enslaved Black people, 1,700 people who routinely cast votes cultivating, conserving, and codifying white supremacy did not view Black people as human beings. Our presidents owned, our presidents sold, our presidents enslaved Black people. The image behind me, this image is the truth of our country's history that our students are denied. This is what lynching in America, this is what it looks like. What we must remember is that for every Black person they hung from a tree, dozens of white people came to celebrate. When our students don't learn about these lynchings in school, it's not to just deny us our justice. It's because racist policymakers don't want white children to know that that may be great-grandpa, smiling in the picture and pointing up at our ancestors, dangling as strange fruit. This is the truth about our country that too many racist lawmakers want to prevent our students from learning. So to young white people across our country, this is your history. The atrocities perpetuated against Black people for generations were committed by your ancestors. Not all of you, but many of you. So you have to know this is American history. So what will you do to help repair the damage? What will you do to help us achieve reparations for the harm done? And if your history books do not teach this history, question the book. Talk to your school district. Tell them that we don't want a whitewashed history. We want and deserve the truth. Thank you, and I yield back.
Lady yields back. The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized. The gentlewoman from Iowa reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you have 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Bush.
The gentlewoman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. St. Louis and I rise today because the violence of white supremacy has once again threatened institutions of Black education across our country, our historically Black colleges and universities. Nearly 30 bomb threats have been levied against HBCUs in recent months. My own alma mater, Harris Stowe State University in St. Louis, was subjected to this dangerous violence on the first day of Black History Month. As one of only 2 HBCUs in Missouri, Harris Stowe should be a safe haven for Black students to learn, to grow, to fully realize their humanity. As proud Harris Stowe Hornets, we know the antidote to white supremacist violence and intimidation is Black education and our liberation. I thank my HBCU sister in service, Congresswoman Adams, for championing this legislation and bringing the issue of white supremacist violence against HBCUs for consideration in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm proud to support this resolution.
Mr. Nadler is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Missouri, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Bush.
Gentlelady from Missouri is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, St. Louis and I rise today in support of the Crown Act. As a Black woman who loves my braids, I know what it's like to feel isolated because of how I wear my hair. This is the last time we say no more to Black people being demeaned and discriminated against for the same hairstyles that corporations profit from. No more to Black people being made to feel like we have to cut our locks just to get a job. This is the last time we say no more to Black people being made to feel like we have to straighten our hair to be deemed professional. No more to Black children being suspended from school because their hair doesn't align with their school's dress code. This is actually a thing, and we are American, and we stand up and we say no more for the last time. We are American. Black hair is not to be policed. I commend my colleagues for their work on the Crown Act, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, Ms. Bush.
Thank you. St. Louis and I thank you, Secretary Mayorkas, for being here with us today. As a country, we have been unified in our response to the crisis in Ukraine. Your department, Secretary Mayorkas, recently unveiled a plan to accelerate admissions from Ukraine with a goal of admitting up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. We know that we have a legal and a moral obligation to welcome those fleeing persecution, wars, and famine. Does the department consider the conditions in the home country of the individual who crosses when assessing for the use of Title 42? For example, is this why Ukrainian nationals coming through our southern border are currently exempt from Title 42?
Congressman, we have built pathways, safe, orderly, and humane pathways for the Ukrainian individuals seeking relief to access the United States. The humanitarian parole program that we have termed Uniting for Ukraine, the refugee process for which we have deployed our personnel overseas, and of course, the visa programs that the Department of State traditionally and historically has administered. As a category of individuals, Ukrainians are not necessarily exempt from Title 42. We provide individualized exemptions depending on acute vulnerabilities, claims under the Convention Against Torture. But what we are really doing is implementing safe and orderly pathways so that individuals do not travel to Mexico with the intent of crossing through a port of entry and into the United States. That is not the safest way to proceed, and that is precisely one of the reasons, just one of the reasons, why we implemented the measures that I have described, to build an orderly and safe way to provide humanitarian relief in the proudest traditions of this country.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Secretary. Last year, DHS designated Haiti for temporary protected status to Haiti. In making that decision, DHS noted that Haiti is grappling with a deteriorating political crisis, violence, and a staggering increase in human rights abuses. Haiti faces the challenges of rising food insecurity and malnutrition, waterborne disease epidemics. Similar conditions exist for Cameroon, which was finally granted TPS status last week. Given this, can you explain why Haitian, Cameroonian, and others fleeing poverty, violence, and war are not exempt from Title 42?
Congresswoman, our experts, not only in U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, but also in the Department of State, review country conditions to determine which countries are eligible for temporary protected status based on the statutory criteria that are set forth. And you correctly note that we reviewed the country conditions last year in Haiti and granted temporary protected status for individuals already resident in the United States from Haiti. We actually, in light of the tragic assassination of the Haitian president last year, extended the period. We have not made a determination that, in fact, a further designation of Haiti is warranted under the statutory criteria. And therefore, we have not extended temporary protected status beyond that which we granted last year. You correctly note as well that our review of the country conditions in Cameroon led us to grant temporary protected status to Cameroonians. Our experts review country conditions against the statutory criteria, the statutory program, and we exercise our discretion accordingly.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time. Earlier this year, I led 100 members of Congress in sending a letter to the administration requesting a departmental review of our immigration system and the disparate treatment of Black migrants. Yes or no, Secretary, are you aware of the disparate treatment of Black migrants at the border?
I would respectfully disagree with that assertion. One of our core principles is equal application of the law in a non-discriminatory manner. I think our designation of temporary protected status for Haitian nationals resident in the United States last year, our recent declaration of...
Reclaiming my time, I have another question. Has the department ever conducted a review of disparate treatment of Black migrants?
The gentlelady's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
I'm sorry, if the question could be repeated, I didn't quite catch it. I apologize, Mr. Chairman.
That's fine, that's fine. Has the department ever conducted a review of disparate treatment of Black migrants?
We have, Congresswoman, a statutorily created Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. I will consult with that office to see whether our department has ever conducted such a review, and we will be back in touch with your office.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. Ms. Bush.
St. Louis and I thank you, Chairman Nadler, for swiftly convening today's hearing. I'm a proud mother of 2 beautiful children. I'm also a person who terminated 2 unexpected pregnancies. I'm here to express my unwavering support for anyone who has ever decided to terminate a pregnancy. Whether a person is seeking abortion care because they were raped, the condom broke, other birth control failed, they didn't have a reliable partner, or couldn't afford a baby, everyone needs accessible options to have an abortion where they live. When I was 17 years old, I was raped. Weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. Without the protections afforded to me by Roe v. Wade, I would have been forced to birth a human being that I could not take care of, and the father would have been my rapist. The emotional devastation of this encounter was traumatic. I didn't know if it was my fault. I didn't know what to do. Did I do something wrong? I hadn't consented, but I blamed myself. The stress of possibly having a child at 18 was more than I could bear. It took a full 2 weeks worth of pay for me to afford an abortion, money that I sorely needed for bills, for food, for my education. For physical, for spiritual, and financial reasons, I knew that this was not the right time for me to bring a life into this world. Ms. Arambide, What has SB 8 and other abortion bans in Texas meant for low-income people of color who need abortions?
Thank you for your question. I think like in the time before Roe, the people most impacted, especially in Texas, are the most marginalized communities. We're talking about Black communities, people of color, Indigenous communities, trans and non-binary people, people in rural communities, people that live on the fringes of society, the immigrants, the undocumented people, and their access to care has been decimated. And for the rest of the people that aren't afraid to seek abortion care because the laws are so confusing or they might, risk being sued, those people have had to travel on average about 1,300 miles, sometimes as far as 2,400 miles to access care that should be available within their community. And that affects so many people in Texas and so many people we love. And we're talking about a state that has not expanded Medicaid. We're talking about a state that cut family planning, that has decimated any sort of support system for these families and people, and abortion has become practically inaccessible for the majority.
Thank you for those critical insights. I remember when I earned around $7 an hour. Baby formula cost around $12 a can. I received formula through WIC, but that only lasted about 2.5 weeks out of the month. That was back around 2000. Over 2 decades later, the cost of baby formula has increased to anywhere between, $17 and $22, and yet the federal minimum wage hasn't changed much since 2009, and it's just $7.25. So poverty is expensive, especially in a society that fails to invest in living wages and a strong social safety net. So here is my message for anyone trying to take away a person's bodily autonomy. If you are for life, you would support universal paid leave. If you are for life, you would support livable wages. If you are for life, you would support affordable childcare, affordable housing, and the expansion of WIC, TANF, and SNAP programs. If you are for life, you would support policies that help children and families meet their material needs. You would support the constitutional right to abortion. Abortion care is health care. Let me say that again. Abortion care is health care, and it is imperative that we protect that right for everyone. Everyone meaning all, everyone. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for convening this hearing. In St. Louis, we know the devastation and the trauma of daily gun violence in our community. It's the drumbeat of violence where 6 people were killed and 14 shot within one weekend, and in one part of our community where the population is only a little over 300,000, and it's not considered an anomaly. It's the daily occurrence of trauma and heartbreak in a community reeling from a nation who's unwilling to act but can. So many people in our community have been directly harmed by gun violence, and everybody in our community has been traumatized in some way. Since the massacre of 19 students and 2 teachers at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas, we have heard a lot of stories, a lot of theories about how best to protect students and how best to protect teachers. At best, these suggestions are absurd distractions, and at worst, they will further harm the very communities in need of our help the most. Communities like mine, communities like Buffalo and Uvalde, Black communities, Latino communities, AAPI communities, our schools, our churches, the list goes on. And we need to address the incidence of gun violence in this country, not with carceral interventionist solutions, but with a public health approach that's rooted in prevention. Mr. Jackson, briefly, what specific strategies has your organization employed to address the gun violence crisis in communities of color? Just briefly.
Really briefly, victim services and support for families, hospital-based violence intervention and prevention strategies, cognitive behavioral therapy programs like Ready Chicago, Advanced Peace, that work with those who are most at risk, creating safe passage for youth as they're coming home. And that's actually a short list of some of the evidence-based models that we know can save lives. And we're fighting for that. You know, cities all over the country are investing their resources We know that community leaders all over the country, thousands of these organizations are fighting to save lives, but yet we're stuck with scraps when it comes to federal resources.
Evidence-based models that save lives. We need to pass out the pamphlet on what you're doing. I am a survivor of gun violence. I've sat with parents who lost their children to gun violence. I've heard from students who sat next to me and talked to me about how they lost friends and they lost classmates and they don't cry, they don't even feel anything anymore, all due to gun violence. Our children want action, but the strategies that I get to hear too often from my fellow colleagues and some on this committee would call for the hardening of schools and for placing armed staff and police officers in academic environments. And it tears me down because I think about as a child when we had fire drills and tornado drills and they taught us, crouch down and cover your head. And I remember we would have these routine drills and I really believed that a tornado was going to come because they made us do this. I believed that a fire drill was coming. It can happen because our school is making us do this. And now they have these active shooter drills. What are we doing? I think about my nephew. I think about my son's safety at school. It's always on my mind as this unrelenting concern about not only their physical safety, but also the emotional toll that they endure through this run, hide, fight reality every single day. So, President Pringle, how has the daily reality of militarized schools and active shooter drills affected our students in these times of extreme gun violence?
We have seen evidence of increased trauma-related illnesses, physical illnesses, as well as our students reporting to us that they are afraid to come to school, that they don't want to go to a grocery store because the violence is in their communities too. We have heard from our teachers that they are leaving our profession because they don't believe that they can protect our students. But they're not stopping. We see our students rising up, don't we? They're demanding that this country protect them and pass gun laws that are common sense, where most Americans agree we should be passing. That's what our students are demanding, that's what our teachers are demanding, and that's what we'll continue to fight for.
Thank you. 81% of those convicted on gun possession charges in my community in the Eastern District of Missouri are Black. And it tears me up when we talk about saving lives. How do we talk about saving lives, but we arm people to be able to take lives, and we arm them easily, and we arm them from the standpoint of it's my right. What about life? Mr. Jackson, in our efforts to save lives and prevent further harm, why is it important for lawmakers to consider the impact of gun control laws and how they affect Black and brown communities?
The gentlelady's time has expired. You may answer the question briefly, Mr. Jackson.
Because this is life or death for us. This is now the #1 cause of death for Black men and the #2 cause of death for Black women and Latino men. And while this may be a political topic for Congress, this is life or death for our communities. I've been nearly shot 5 times, despite going to church, like the member said before, despite saying the Pledge of Allegiance every day in school. Gun violence surrounds us every single day, and we're dropping like flies. And we don't need more carceral strategies. What we need are real investments in our communities, real investments in prevention strategies that we know work, and we need someone to stand up against the flood of firearms that are pouring into our communities. Guns don't grow on trees. We are not creating these guns. They are being flooded into our communities, and the gun industry is profiting off of our death every single day.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from...
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Bush, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. St. Louis, and I thank you, Chairman. So just a few weeks ago on Juneteenth, I introduced into the congressional record a document to commemorate the unveiling of the Freedom Suits Memorial Monument. The Freedom Suits Memorial paid tribute to the hundreds of cases in which enslaved Black people filed for their freedom from bondage in federal courts in St. Louis. The most famous case was that of Dred Scott, in which the court held that Black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Dred Scott is buried in St. Louis, in my district, and his legacy serves as a reminder of the dangers in believing that the Supreme Court has always been a just body. It has not. Substantive due process itself was birthed in the aftermath of the Civil War. It was not legal doctrine that led to the Emancipation Proclamation. It was not the court. It was not the Constitution, which was written to guarantee the rights of land-holding white men. It was not moral righteousness that led to the Emancipation Proclamation or the emancipation of Black people. It was violence. It was war. It was the resistance and the persistence of abolitionists that put an end to chattel slavery. And it was because of our freedom dreams that the collective dreams of Black people, past and present, who demanded to live in a world free of bondage. It is not lost on me as a descendant of enslaved people and as the first Black Congresswoman from the state of Missouri that my existence in this space alone is a testament to the freedoms denied by the Supreme Court of the United States in its Dred Scott decision 165 years ago. Professor Murray, footnote 41 of the majority opinion in Dobbs makes a eugenics argument on the impact of abortion in Black communities. Can you explain the significance of footnote 41 as it relates to contraception?
Sure. To coin a term used by Representative Owens, you might view this as a kind of condescending racism, the court attempting to link the history of the modern birth control movement and reproductive rights to the history of eugenics for the purpose of essentially arguing that reproductive rights are rooted in a history of racial injustice. I believe that this footnote doesn't really bear on the logic of the Dobbs opinion, but rather is there to seed an opening for eventually overruling the right to contraception on the ground that it is a racial injustice. The idea being that Margaret Sanger, through her work with the eugenics movement, was essentially trafficking in racial injustice. And for that reason, the right to contraception should be overruled as a means of remedying that racial injustice. It is the most craven form of racial condescension, in part because it is being parroted by those who do nothing to assist the Black community, whether in their judicial opinions or in their actions in other beings.
Thank you. Another question for you, Professor Murray. The Reconstruction Amendments were drafted not only to eradicate slavery, but also to eradicate the vestiges of slavery and all forms of bondage. The drafters wanted to go farther than making Black people citizens and wanted to guarantee a sense of liberty. Can you talk about how the drafters defined or understood liberty when drafting the 13th and 14th Amendment?
Yeah, so if the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote, the 14th Amendment was primarily concerned with eradicating all of the indicia of slavery, the very things that distinguish slavery from freedom, among them the absence of bodily autonomy and control over procreation. And this was very clear. They knew about forced birth as a means of expanding the slave population in the period before the Civil War. So they were responding to this. They also wanted to correct the injustice of having no family integrity, of lacking control over your children, of being ineligible for civil marriage. So in that grant of liberty in the 14th Amendment precedes all of these rights that had been denied to the enslaved and were now given to them. They weren't explicit because they were viewed to be captured in that grant of liberty. Justice Alito says nothing about this. It is a selective and itinerant commitment to originalism that his opinion evinces.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Murray. As has been noted, this is the first time the court has taken away a fundamental right. It is important to note that our most fundamental rights have never been safe, and they never will be guaranteed so long as they depend on the ideological whim of 9 unaccountable, unelected justices with lifetime appointments. It is why we need to limit the power of justices by expanding the court, instituting term limits, enacting a code of ethics, and it reinforces why Congress should strip the court of the right to take away fundamental rights. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. St. Louis and I rise today in full support of President Biden's student debt relief plan in the face of Republican efforts to block economic relief for millions of people. The $1.9 trillion student debt crisis has cost people more than just money. It has stripped countless people of the opportunity to start a family, buy a home, start a business, or further their education. My office has been collecting heartbreaking stories from constituents across Missouri's 1st District about how student debt relief would impact their lives for the better. Here are some of their stories. Michelle H. writes, "The ongoing gloom and constant worry of student loan debt will lessen significantly. Even if some of the debt that I've accumulated through student loans was forgiven, my entire quality of life will drastically increase and my mental health will also increase. This would be absolutely life-changing." Amy V. notes, "We will be able to buy a house, my first mortgage. This will allow me to pay off other bills and increase my credit score. I cannot afford the monthly payment of over $900 per month." Allison M. writes, "I have been swimming in debt since I graduated college with a degree and a job. At one point, I couldn't even afford to move out of my parents' because my student loans were over $1,000. Sally Mae ruined my credit score, and now that I finally have somewhat of a stable income, if this debt relief comes through, I can actually see a light at the end of still a long tunnel. But before, I never even thought there was such a light." These are just 3 of the 43 million borrowers who are depending on transformative student debt relief measures that will change their lives forever. I'd like to share my own personal story of my journey grappling with immense student loan debt. As a single mom of 2, working an hourly job that made less than $10 an hour, even after working there for 10 years, I struggled to provide for my family and for myself. I knew I needed a change, a career change, but that meant I would need to go back to school and that I would ultimately incur student debt. I thought that once I graduated and I got a steady job, I would be able to pay it back quickly. So I enrolled into nursing school, took out loans, and a few years later, I was a registered nurse. For the most part, everything went as I expected, and it wasn't until I was faced with that first payment that I realized just how astronomical this debt burden became. Even with a job that paid more money than I had ever made before, it still felt impossible to be able to pay it off. Ultimately, I was able to pay off my student loans, but it took years. During those years, I struggled to pay these loans. I faced multiple eviction notices and was evicted, had difficulty feeding my 2 babies and affording childcare as I worked long and odd hours as a nurse. It was hard at times. It felt impossible. I would have welcomed debt relief, and it's why I am pushing so hard to remove that economic burden for current and future generations. Education should be affordable, equitable, and accessible to absolutely everyone. It should lead to prosperity and opportunity, not debt. I share these stories with you, my colleagues, and implore us all to continue supporting the Biden administration and backing down the dark money and right-wing attacks on student debt relief, and to continue standing with borrowers by extending the payment pause beyond December 31st and using every single legal authority to deliver student debt relief. We have a responsibility and an obligation to cancel student debt now. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Bush, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Bush?
Yes, St. Louis, and I thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this important hearing. And let me say to the witnesses, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for staying. And sorry you have to listen to the white supremacy raise its ugly head, throughout this hearing, but we're here to fight it. And so I just want to make sure you know that. The rise of hate and violence against
Madam
the
Chair,
LGBTQIA community follows a surge of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation driven by Republican state lawmakers, including in my home state of Missouri. The Human Rights Campaign has found that Republican state legislators have introduced and supported over 340 anti-queer and or trans bills in the latest legislative session, and 25 extreme discriminatory bills have already been signed into law across this country. According to Promo Missouri, in 2020, the Missouri State House introduced 23 pieces of anti-LGBT plus legislation. They've repeatedly, it's absolutely disgusting, filed library book bans, bans on doctor-recommended care, student organization bans, and sports bans. Ms. Robinson, could you tell us more about the draconian measures state Republicans have advanced that target the health, the safety, and the rights of our LGBT plus community?
It's a crisis that we're experiencing. We are trying to simply be able to live freely, safely, and wholly as our true selves in every aspect of life. And what we see is continued legislative attacks paired with extremist rhetoric. And when some of these bills are moving forward, whether or not they're enacted, it has a devastating impact on our community. Looking at Florida again, as a Don't Say Gay or Trans bill was moving in state legislature, we saw it paired with an intentional social media campaign that resulted in a 400% increase in anti-LGBTQ plus hate and slurs happening online. And the majority of it was perpetuated by 10 bad actors. This is the stuff that we have to make sure that we're interrupting and ending. This is what's creating a dangerous environment for our children, for our kids, and for our families.
Thank you. Hate drives these Republican bills, which in turn drive dangerous hate and violence towards our LGBTQ plus community. In Missouri, my state, we have seen multiple hate-driven murders of our trans siblings in recent years. As part of Missouri's Republicans' obsessive attack on trans and gay rights, they introduced legislation that would have criminalized parents and health services for providing care approved by the American Academy of Pediatrics and other leading organizations. They even sought to turn bills into ballot initiatives to drum up further hate and have run for office on platforms grounded in anti-LGBTQ plus hate. Dr. Meyer, what is the connection between the Republican crusade to target the LGBTQ plus community and the surge of hateful anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric online?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that this rhetoric fuels, as I said before, what is already underlying American culture and history. And to fan these hateful messages just encourages bad actors. And I agree with what was said here. There are bad actors, but we also have to pay attention to the environment in which we live, and the kind of environment either inhibits or encourages hateful acts. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hunt, let me turn to you. How is America's transgender community disproportionately harmed by the extremism and the violence the committee is examining today, particularly speaking about Black and Brown transgender women?
One thing that we see repeatedly in the studies that we've done on the trans population is that trans people are about, on average, 3 to 4 times as likely to experience almost any negative outcome that you can expect in our society, be that unemployment, direct violence, negative experiences with the police, homelessness, discrimination in healthcare, anything along those lines, tends to hit trans people about 3 to 5 times as high as national, 3 to 5 times as much as the national average. And what we see consistently through all of these numbers is that trans people of color, and particularly Black trans women and Indigenous trans women, experience 3 to 4 times as high negative results or negative outcomes on all of those factors.
Thank you. The rise of anti-queer and/or trans extremism is a danger to our country, our nation, and we must act swiftly and urgently to eliminate it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady